In 1972, a U.S. Navy saturation diver descended 400 feet into the freezing dark of the Sea of Okhotsk. Soviet territorial waters, surrounded on three sides by the Soviet Pacific Fleet, and clamped a 6-foot recording pod onto a Soviet military cable. He never cut it, he never spliced it. The Soviets never detected a thing. For 9 years, every single month, an American submarine penetrated that inland sea and recovered the tape. 50,000 hours of unencrypted Soviet naval traffic. Every admiral, every nuclear submarine deployment order, every missile test. The most successful cable tap operation ever run. Then one NSA employee walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and sold the entire program for $35,000. This is File 16, The Wire in the Water. The Sea of Okhotsk is a body of water the size of Texas, bordered on three sides by Soviet territory. The Kamchatka Peninsula closes its eastern flank. Sakhalin Island and the Soviet mainland frame the west. The Kuril Island chain, a string of fortified Soviet possessions, closes the southern entrance. For an American warship, transiting the sea was an act of war. For an American submarine, transiting submerged was an act of espionage that violated Soviet territorial waters under every interpretation of the law of the sea. But on the floor of that inland sea, running from Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky to Soviet Pacific Fleet command facilities on the Okhotsk mainland coast, lay a thick armored telecommunications cable. The cable carried the Soviet Pacific Fleet's operational naval traffic. Admirals talking to ship captains, deployment orders for nuclear submarines, missile test telemetry, daily readiness reports. And every byte of that traffic was unencrypted. The Soviets had decided that the inland sea was unreachable, that no foreign intelligence service could possibly tap a cable on the floor of waters they completely surrounded. So the traffic on that cable was sent in plain Russian. Inside the National Security Agency, that cable became the most valuable target on Earth. But the only platform capable of reaching it was the USS Halibut, a one-of-a-kind former missile submarine that had been quietly converted for special projects at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, with a saturation diving compartment, a lockout trunk that allowed divers to leave and return without the boat surfacing, and 400-foot operational endurance for a small team of Navy saturation divers. The plan was simple to describe. The Halibut would penetrate Soviet territorial waters submerged, navigate to the cable, deploy divers from the lockout trunk, place a recording pod on the cable, and withdraw, all without leaving any evidence that the operation had ever occurred. And then, every month for years afterward, return to retrieve the recordings. The plan took 18 months of saturation diving training in Florida pools to make even theoretically possible. The first deployment was authorized for the summer of 1972. The principle of an inductive cable tap is older than electronics. Michael Faraday demonstrated electromagnetic induction in 1831. The discovery that a changing magnetic field in one conductor induces a corresponding current in any nearby conductor. The cable on the Sea of Okhotsk seabed was alive with current. Every signal traveling through its inner conductors radiated a faint electromagnetic field outward through the cable's insulation to a sensitive coil of copper wire wrapped around the outside of the cable. That field was a perfect echo of the signal inside. Read the field, record it, walk away. The cable itself never changes. The conductors are never cut, never spliced, never physically modified. The Soviet operators monitoring cable health would see absolutely nothing. NSA's engineering branch built the recording pod over the winter of 1971. 6 feet long, matte black steel housing. An internal cassette deck the size of a microwave. An internal battery pack rated for 40 days of continuous recording. Magnetic clamp arms at the base for placement on the cable. The pod was rated for diver handling at 400 feet of depth in helium-oxygen-breathing atmosphere. It was tested 247 times against a mock cable in a Florida lab. The recording fidelity was over 99%. The cable disturbance was, by every measurement available to the engineers, undetectable. In the spring of 1972, the pod was loaded onto the USS Halibut at her Pacific operating base. The Halibut departed under cover of a routine patrol cover story. She transited the North Pacific submerged for 5 weeks, rounded the southern Kuril Island chain, entered the Sea of Okhotsk, and navigated by gravity map charts to a single point on the seabed deep within the Sea of Okhotsk along the cable route from the Soviet naval base at Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. The boat hovered motionless above the seabed at depth. And then the Navy saturation divers went out through the lockout trunk. The first Ivy Bells pod went down on the cable in the summer of 1972. For 9 years, the operation continued without interruption. Every month, a U.S. Navy submarine, first the USS Halibut, later the USS Seawolf, eventually the USS Parche, entered the Sea of Okhotsk submerged, navigated to the same point on the seabed, deployed divers from a lockout trunk, and recovered the previous month's pod. They placed a fresh pod, and the boat withdrew. Each pod returned a magnetic tape thick with the unencrypted operational traffic of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. Admirals talking to ship captains, submarine deployment orders, missile test telemetry, daily readiness reports, nuclear readiness states for the Pacific Submarine Force, Soviet naval doctrine, evolving in real time. The recordings were ferried back to NSA processing at Fort Meade. Russian language analysts transcribed them. The product flowed to the Pacific Fleet, to the National Security Council, to the President's daily intelligence brief. For 9 years, the United States had a complete picture of Soviet Pacific Fleet activity. Sourced not from defectors, not from photographic intelligence, not from satellite signals, but from a 6-foot recording pod sitting on the floor of the Sea of Okhotsk, listening to a cable the Soviets believed could not be touched. NSA analytical sections at Fort Meade processed approximately 50,000 cumulative recording hours from the Ivy Bells pod. Across the 1972 through 1981 operational window, the cumulative product established for the United States the most detailed picture of any Soviet operational fleet that any Western intelligence service ever produced across the entire Cold War. The Ivy Bells product was so sensitive that fewer than 200 people inside the entire United States intelligence community knew the operation existed. And one of those 200 people was about to walk into the Soviet embassy in Washington and sell every detail of it. On a January afternoon in 1980, a man named Ronald Pelton walked through the front gate of the Soviet embassy on 16th Street in Washington, D.C. Pelton had worked at the National Security Agency for 14 years. He had been one of the fewer than 200 people cleared for the Ivy Bells code word. He had recently resigned from NSA, was deeply in personal financial distress, and had calculated that the only asset he owned worth selling was the contents of his memory. Inside the embassy, he sat down with a Soviet handler and described from memory the Ivy Bells operation, the Sea of Okhotsk, the cable, the pod, the submarine deployment cycles, the monthly recovery schedule. He drew a freehand map of the tap location on a piece of paper. He accepted approximately $35,000 in cash. He left. Roughly 18 months later, in 1981, a Soviet Pacific Fleet salvage vessel anchored at the exact coordinates Pelton had drawn. Soviet saturation divers descended to the cable. They found the Ivy Bells pod. They detached it from the cable, hauled it to the surface, and photographed it from every angle. The pod is reportedly displayed in a Moscow Intelligence Services Museum, where Russian sources claim it sits behind glass. The next month, when the USS Parche returned to the Sea of Okhotsk for routine recovery, Navy divers descended to the cable site and found the seabed empty. The clamp arms of the previous pod had left no trace. The cable was undisturbed. The operation was over. NSA's counterintelligence branch realized within weeks that Ivy Bells had been compromised. The list of cleared personnel was short. The list of cleared personnel in financial distress was shorter. The list of cleared personnel in financial distress who had recently resigned was a single name. The FBI arrested Ronald Pelton in 1986. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to 3 concurrent life terms in federal prison. He was released on parole, having served 30 years in 2015. Operation Ivy Bells, 9 years of total acoustic intelligence on the Soviet Pacific Fleet. The most successful Cold War cable tap operation in history had ended because one man in financial distress had walked into an embassy in Washington with a piece of memory worth $35,000 to a foreign service. Operation Ivy Bells demonstrated a new theorem about communications infrastructure that has only become more dangerous in the half-century since. Any wire that carries information radiates an electromagnetic signature of that information outward through its insulation. Any conductor placed close enough to the wire can read that signature without touching the wire. The technique requires no incision, no splice, no detectable disturbance to the wire's normal operation. A nation can spend billions of dollars on encryption, on protocol security, on transit network protection. None of it matters if the physical wire carrying the encrypted bytes can be approached, surrounded by an induction coil, and read passively from outside. The modern world runs on a single physical fact. 99% of all international internet traffic flows through fiber optic cables lying on the floor of the world's oceans. Those cables are mapped on public charts because the cable-laying industry needs them mapped. Every telecom company on Earth knows where every cable is. Every navy in the world knows where every cable is. And every intelligence agency capable of operating undersea research vessels has somewhere in their inventory a modern descendant of the Ivy Bells pod. The pod has gotten smaller. It has gotten quieter. It no longer has to be retrieved monthly because it can transmit its recordings acoustically to a passing receiver. It can now sit on a cable indefinitely, listening, sending its product home in compressed bursts that look like background ocean noise to anyone monitoring for it. The Russian Navy operates a fleet of specialized oceanographic research vessels, the Yantar, the Academic Alexandrov, and several smaller hulls that have been observed by Western navies loitering for weeks at a time directly above known transatlantic and transpacific fiber optic cable routes. The Russian Defense Ministry describes the vessels as scientific platforms. NATO intelligence services describe them as the modern descendants of the USS Halibut. The United States Navy operates its own modern equivalents, as does the People's Liberation Army Navy, as do the United Kingdom and France. In 2022, a series of unexplained cable cuts in the Baltic Sea and the North Sea forced European telecommunications operators to restore traffic by emergency rerouting through alternate cables. Some of those alternate cables happen to pass within 20 kilometers of known Russian oceanographic research vessel deployment patterns. Whether that pattern was coincidence or intent has never been publicly resolved. Modern fiber optic cables carry not just internet traffic. They carry interbank settlement traffic between every major financial institution on Earth. They carry military command traffic between continents. They carry medical records, court records, citizen identity records, electrical grid telemetry, water system control signals. Every one of those data streams is encrypted in transit. None of that encryption protects the metadata patterns visible to a passive induction coil. None of it protects against traffic analysis attacks that infer who is talking to whom, when, and how often, even when the message contents themselves remain unreadable. The economic damage potential of a successful modern undersea cable intercept operation is correspondingly larger. than anything the Cold War-era Ivy Bell's pod could have produced. A modern interception of European-American interbank settlement traffic at the cable level could give a foreign intelligence service operational visibility into every major financial institution's daily settlement positions. A modern interception of military command traffic between continents could give a foreign intelligence service operational visibility into Western strategic deployment patterns in real time. A modern interception of medical records traffic could give a foreign intelligence service operational visibility into the health profiles of senior Western political and military leadership. The session is logged, the connection is closed, the files remain open. Every cable on every ocean floor on this planet is, somewhere, being approached by a modern descendant of the USS Halibut. Every cable is a wire in the water, every wire is a target. Which leaves us with the closing question of File 16. Which undersea cable on this planet do you trust the least? To not have a 6-foot recording pod sitting next to it right now, listening to your country's data, your bank's transactions, your hospital's medical records, and quietly sending its product home to a foreign capital.